Good morning, everyone. This is Bernd Christian Giels coming to you, the guy with the funny name here in much of America. Today is Tuesday, June 30th, 2020. Yes, congratulations, you have survived the first year of one of the most bizarre, stressful years in recent memory. So I congratulate you, I congratulate myself, and you go out and congratulate all of your friends for having survived what has proven to be a very, very memorable half a year, which we'll probably be talking about for decades to come. So, as I said, my name is Bernd Christian Giels. You have reached me here at my YouTube channel, so welcome to both my returning viewers and my new viewers. As I noted in my introductory video, the purpose of my channel is to educate, inspire, and entertain my viewers, no matter where they are, who they are, and what they're doing. So I welcome you. One of the challenges that I have found in the time since I started this channel is the fact that I have a lot of ideas coming to my mind, and I only have so much time in the day to produce them, write them down, and then record them for my channel. And I have been resisting doing too much in a day because I have a lot of other things going on in life right now besides building out a whole YouTube channel. But given current events, I have decided to the best of my ability, do more than one episode in the next few days, possibly up to a week, because there is a lot going on in the world that I would like to comment on right now. So, I'm going to be recording two different videos today. This one that you're watching now is focused on the COVID-19 pandemic as it is manifesting in the state of Texas. The second video I'm going to record shortly thereafter is the first in a series in which I profile some of the most influential people from my own life. So, as for this episode, as basically everyone alive on the planet knows right now, we are going through a very challenging time. Some people have likened the current moment in the world to a combination of the years 1918, 1929, and the late 1960s. Here in the United States of America, where I'm recording this, we have a pandemic that rivals the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918. We have an economic mess that rivals the year 1929 in this country. And we have the issue of police brutality and race relations, once again thrust to the forefront of the news cycle due to the recent horrific death of George Floyd at the hands of a Minneapolis police officer on May 25th of this year. So we are living through an extraordinary time with extraordinary levels of stress and uncertainty. So that is why I congratulated all of you, my viewers, that you have survived what the first half of this year has doled out to you. So I'm going to speak today about the humanitarian disaster that I believe the state of Texas is on the verge of, if not already in the beginnings of, or perhaps even in the middle of now. So, to produce content for this channel, I read through a lot of media sources to inspire ideas and the commentary that I then prepare. A recent piece in the New York Times was a very gripping article for me to read, and it began, as I recall, with quoting Michael T. Osterholm. He is an epidemiologist at the University of Minnesota. This article was in appearance last week on the New York Times. I don't remember exactly what day it was published. Anyway, this article quoted Michael Osterholm as saying, "Apologies, I am near the Hyannis Airport and the planes are sometimes loud." One moment. These are the perils of not having your own dedicated indoor broadcasting and recording studio. So, one moment. So, Mr. Osterholm of the University of Minnesota was quoted as saying, "Be humble and be bold and make rigorous preparations." And he was, of course, referring to the COVID-19 pandemic. And I wanted to unpack that one sentence just a little bit to give you my interpretation of what exactly he is saying to the rest of us. In saying be humble, I believe he's saying that we need to be mindful and thoughtful about the fact that we are dealing with a virus that we have only been actively trying to gain large amounts of knowledge about for the last 6 months or so. Those who were alive during the AIDS epidemic of the 1980s can recall that it took years for the federal government of the United States of America to begin to address the severity of that epidemic. And even today, over 3 decades after the AIDS epidemic started, we still are searching for more effective therapeutics and an actual vaccine for HIV. So we don't necessarily learn about viruses very quickly. So we are in the learning phase. We are on the learning curve, on the steep part of the curve, I would argue, in learning about the coronavirus that is responsible for the COVID-19 pandemic. So we have a lot of learning to do. And when you have a lot of learning to do, a great way to approach the learning is with something you could call learner's mind. And learner's mind is something that you can apply more effectively, I would argue, if you are humble. And by that I mean you have an awareness of the fact that most of us know very little about very little. Even people that get doctorates and spend their lives in research know a lot about very little in the world. There is so much to learn, so much to comprehend, so much to experience in a lifetime that there aren't enough hours in the day to do as much as some of us want to do, myself included. So we need to approach the pandemic with a sense of very immense humility, I would say. Osterholm also said, be bold. So what is he saying there? I believe he's saying we need to be bold. We need to take bold action against this virus, against this pandemic. We need to take concerted, bold, thorough, effective action right now. And sadly, in many parts of this country, we are not taking sufficiently bold, proactive, thorough action. So we must be bolder than we're being. We need to support our government in finding effective therapeutics. We need to support our neighbors and our friends, our families, our communities, our states. We need to find in this moment the invitation to come together that it truly can be seen as, rather than sadly indulge in our very American behavior of thinking a lot about ourselves and not very much about other people. That is my opinion. Finally, we need to make very rigorous preparations. When people live in places that are prone to hurricanes or tornadoes or earthquakes, they are wisely advised by authorities to have an emergency kit in their homes. Things like water, batteries, a flashlight, some amount of food that can last you for several days, if not weeks. In a similar way, we need to be prepared for the very potential that this pandemic is going to go on for a while, and that it's going to require us to continue to live in a radically restructured way as compared to what we lived in 2019 and before. So, regarding my life in Texas, I was born in Texas. I spent the first 22 years of my life there. I attended public high school there, and after graduating, I later attended Texas A&M University, where I completed my undergraduate degree in atmospheric science. I became fascinated with the weather as a young kid because, as I said in an earlier episode, Texas has very volatile weather much of the year. Now, in the article that I wrote last week, in which I articulated my thinking that there is in fact a humanitarian disaster on the doorstep in Texas, I list a number of factors that I believe are all coming together to put the state at high risk of a memorable, historic, disruptive public health mess. And one of those is the weather. So when we first started learning about the pandemic, we understood the virus to be something that primarily impacted the respiratory system in our bodies. More recent research that I have read is now beginning to reveal that actually, apparently, the coronavirus impacts many organs in the body, that many people who get sick with it can end up being sick for weeks, if not months, with at least some mild symptoms, if not worse. So even though the elderly and people of color and the poor have often been highlighted to some degree as the people most suffering from the pandemic, we are all at risk of being either directly impacted by becoming infected ourselves or losing friends, family members, co-workers, community members who are very important to our own lives. So, in regards to the weather, the hottest days on average in the state of Texas are in July and August. Tomorrow is the beginning of July. I know from growing up in Texas how insufferable, intolerable the heat can be, especially in July and August. I've sometimes likened it to walking out into a blast furnace at night. You can go out on nights in August in Texas and it will be 95 degrees at 11 at night. It is a very hot place to be in the summer. And therefore, it's not an ideal place to be at all when you consider how the heat stress of being in Texas right now adds to the stress for people who are already sick with a virus. So this surge in cases that they're now witnessing in Texas is coming at a horrible time. It is coming at a time when the heat stress that is typical of every summer in Texas is reaching its peak. So that is one factor. Another factor is just the ongoing stress of living through this time with a pandemic that has now spread to 6 of the 7 continents of the world. Maybe it's even in Antarctica. I haven't seen a story about that, but it's very easy for that to happen at this point. So we are living through a very turbulent time in this country right now. We have seen media coverage of police brutality, the mistreatment of people of color, institutional and structural racism, economic collapse, millions of Americans out of work. All of these things are very disorienting and stressful for, I would wager, a vast majority of us. Yes, we all have different levels of resilience to stress, but all of us are living through a time right now that is extraordinarily anxiety-provoking and stressful. The next major factor, obviously the foundational factor for this potential humanitarian disaster, is the surging cases in the state currently. I regularly check the case numbers throughout the country on virtually a daily basis, and the curve showing the growth of cases in Texas essentially is now replicating an exponential curve. And for those of you who are not very math savvy, exponential curves are curves in which the growth of something grows in a non-linear way. Linear growth basically means you have the same amount of something added each day. So let's say you had a garden and the garden had 15 watermelons growing in it. And then a week from now you had 20. And then a week from then you had 25. So every 7 days you would have another 5. So it's easy to predict when something is growing in a linear way because it's the same amount of growth over the same amount of time. Exponential curves are not like that. Exponential curves indicate something growing faster and faster as time passes. And the speed of growth, the speed at which the growth is occurring, itself grows as indicated by the slope of the exponential curve when you look at it. So when you look at the state of Texas, you see an exponential curve in the growth of cases. Another major factor at play in this current debacle is the issue of leadership within the state of Texas. Now, I would argue that the two United States senators for the state of Texas are displaying inadequate leadership and forethought, mindfulness about this issue. The two current senators of Texas are John Cornyn and Senator Ted Cruz. Senator Cruz gained some renown and recognition a number of years ago when he spent time on the Senate floor, as I understand, reading from the book by Dr. Seuss, Green Eggs and Ham. So we have a United States senator that spent time and taxpayer money to riddle us with a story of Dr. Seuss as the United States Senator of the United States of America. Now, that's not the best use of taxpayer dollars, and in no way am I saying that Democrats and independents also don't do stupid things or waste time or waste money. But I would argue that it is especially common in the Republican Party of the United States of America of 2020. So we don't have the type of leadership at the federal level representing Texas in the U.S. Senate. We do not have the type of leadership that we would benefit from that could provide a more robust response to this pandemic. I regularly look at many people's Twitter feeds, including the Twitter feed of John Cornyn, and the amount of time and energy spent on the seriousness of this pandemic is, in my opinion, wanting. He could be doing more. The entire United States Senate could be doing more right now. And I personally believe that if they take an August recess, that is the typical length that they take, that it is at this point unethical for the entirety of the United States Senate to leave town, leave Washington, D.C. in August and go home for 4 or 5 weeks, whatever they ultimately take. We have multiple crises going on in this country right now on June 30th, 2020. We need effective leadership, and we are seriously lacking in that at the highest levels of power in this country. The next factor that is of serious concern that I believe contributes to the risk of a disaster in the state is how the pandemic has hobbled many critical parts of our lives. One extremely critical part of our lives is the education system. Now, as anyone knows who has been following the story of the pandemic for the last several months, a lot of kids were sent home from school in March and have not even been back in a regular classroom in 2.5, 3 months. And there's questions now, obviously, about what's going to happen in the fall. Will kids go back to school? How will that be managed? So millions of kids across the United States of America lost out on schooling. And schooling isn't just a good thing for the purpose of providing an education for kids. Schooling also provides kids exposure to the arts, the humanities, music, creativity, and it's a place where they learn social skills, how to relate to their fellow peers. And a lot of that has been wiped away, and the burden of educating them has been placed in large measure, in many cases, on the parents of these kids. And it's not just the school system. You can also I could spend a whole episode talking about all of the challenges that we've borne witness to in the healthcare system. The lack of personal protective equipment, or PPE as it's known. The understaffing of certain types of facilities that makes it much more likely that clusters of coronavirus will appear. It's also been well documented, for example, that a large number of people dying of this virus have been sickened with it in nursing homes and long-term care facilities. So my point is, in regards to this factor, is that there are many institutions that were inadequately prepared and under-resourced to deal with something of this scale. One of the last factors that I want to mention here is, actually the last factor, it's the limitation on, how shall I say this, the protections and the design in the workplace, right? So before this pandemic happened, we did not have a society that was designed for social distancing. Our urban geography, the way we run schools, movie theaters, massage parlors, barbers, public government buildings, they were not designed really to think of requiring people to have to be at least 6 feet apart. And in the state of Texas specifically, I would argue that the culture of the state has made it more vulnerable to a pandemic because in Texas, there are certain very big industries. They are meat, religion, and prisons. These three industries employ many people, and these three industries presuppose close contact with other people. I once worked at a Tyson chicken plant in Arkansas a number of years ago. I experienced what it's like to work in the meatpacking industry, and social distancing is not something that was built into the business model of the meatpacking industry. So it comes as no surprise, really, that meatpacking plants have been a particular location where coronavirus outbreaks have occurred. And then religion and prisons. It's the same basic problem regarding social distancing. People come together in churches for a common experience of worship. People shake each other's hands at the sign of peace. That's how I was brought up in the Catholic Church. People hug one another. And then they go to communion to receive the body and blood of Christ, as it's believed to be. They go to communion and experience that sacrament. But in a world with a virus like we're dealing with now, that sort of thing is not wise to do. And then finally, prisons. Prisons necessarily make it very difficult to engage in social distancing. Imagine, prisoners having at least one cellmate. How do you socially distance if you're living with someone in the same room and sleeping in the same room night after night after night? And similar to what I said yesterday with the firefighting realm, facilities for prisoners are communal facilities. People go to the same cafeteria, they sit down at tables together and eat. So socially distancing in places like the meat industry, religion, and prisons is a big challenge. And therefore, because these are big industries in Texas, it put the state at particular risk of having a pandemic that could get out of control. And just as a fascinating particular anecdote here, in the article that I wrote, I noted that a recent Washington Post piece indicated that of the 25 rural counties with the highest per capita case rates, 20 of those 25 have a meatpacking plant or a prison where the virus took hold and spread with abandon, and then leaped into the community when workers took it home. 20 out of 25 counties. That's 80%. Think of 80% of anything, 80% of your income, 80% of your time, 80% of your energy. That is a lot. So this is a serious problem, and these industries have the unique challenge of figuring out a way to go forward, but doing so in a redesigned way to minimize the risk of this public health nightmare becoming even worse. So, given all these factors put together, the weather, The surging number of cases, the overwhelmed institutions, the workplaces not designed with social distancing remotely in mind, it comes as no real surprise that you would see what is happening in Texas happening, as well as what is happening in Arizona and Florida and many other states that I won't go into at this time. So, though I am no longer a resident of the state of Texas, and though I no longer have any intention to live there in the future, it still pains me as a former resident, as someone who was born there, to witness from afar what is unfolding in the state of Texas. Much of what is happening, I would argue, was preventable, or at least could have been much more successfully mitigated if these factors contributing to this nightmare had not been in place. Now, the weather you can't do much about. It's generally hot in Texas every summer, so that would have been a given. But our institutions, our design of our workplaces, those factors we have control over in the present moment. We can change them. And I would argue that we must change them, and that most of what we're doing now to change them apparently will need to be in place for a while. Because it seems now that the way the pandemic is going to unfold, based on what I've read and the data that I've looked at, is that it will continue to be at least a slow burn pandemic. What I mean by that is like putting a pot of water on a stove and then you take it to a boil and then put it to the back burner and it boils on lower heat for a while. So it's in the background. It's something that's always there. That is what we are, I think, going to witness throughout the summer, at least. But in some of these states that are experiencing surging cases, they might become epicenters, hotspots for many weeks, for a month, for more than a month. We could have a situation where by August 1st, the death total in this country is 150,000 people, easily, with thousands of those deaths happening in Texas and Florida and Arizona and many other states. So, in closing, I want to reiterate that my intention in producing this video was to share my thoughts and concerns, my observations about the pandemic, and as it's happening specifically in Texas. I feel great empathy for all of us going through this situation right now. It is tragic. It was, in fair measure, preventable. And even now, with how bad it is now on June 30th in the year 2020, here in the United States of America, it is still something that we can do a better job to get a hold of. We can still make choices today and tomorrow and the next day that will help us move in a better direction. So thank you for listening to this video. I hope it has inspired some deep thinking and reflection, and I welcome you to continue on my journey on this YouTube channel. Everyone have a wonderful day to the best of your ability. Just know that many, many other people are going through difficult times as well. Let's reach out to one another and support one another during this very challenging time. Cheers.